Hi there. I'm going to talk about Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss sections 1 through 18, which is the first part of this book. First, some remarks by way of introduction about Nietzsche. In this class so far, we have discussed the aesthetic theories of Plato, Kant, and Hegel. Nietzsche is the threshold of what we refer to as the postmodern era. He's the first postmodern thinker. His critique of Western philosophy and Christianity, as well as science and democracy, this is all considered to be, a major break with the tradition. And looking ahead to what is coming in the 20th century. Nietzsche is a groundbreaking thinker. And I think that is evident in this book that you read. I hope you found it good to read. He's a good writer. He's definitely interesting, and he's definitely different than Hegel and Kant. He's much more informal. And by the way, this is his most formal work. For Nietzsche, the rest of he wrote a lot of books, and his books tend to be much more informal going forward, especially towards the end of his life. And what I mean by that specifically, Nietzsche wrote in the format of aphorisms. He tends to write later, especially, he tends to write short emissions, a collection of them, maybe a paragraph, maybe a sentence or two, and then a break, and then another thought, and so on. He does not write in contiguous paragraphs later on. This book is different. This book is his best organized piece. I actually enjoy it the most. I think it is it's my favorite work of Nietzsche. He wrote it at a young age. This is his first work, in case I didn't say that already. I believe he was 28 at the time. Nietzsche lives the latter half of the 19th century. He dies just in 1900, by the way. He was a brilliant student and becomes a professor at a very young age for Germany, that is. I think he was a professor already at 28 by the time he gets to, his first appointment is in Basel, in the northern part of Switzerland. He doesn't last, though. He decides to leave academia at a young age and then spends the rest of his life living an itinerant lifestyle, basically, traveling to northern Italy and Switzerland. He leaves Germany permanently at a certain point. He was very critical of Germans. In 1889, you can see, that his work becomes more frenetic and more aphoristic in the late 1880s. And then in 1889, he has a kind of a mental breakdown and spends the rest of his life in a catatonic state where he is tended to by his sister, who was gripped by early Nazi ideology and adopts his language of the Übermensch, the superior. The Übermensch translates into English as the overman, the superman, if you will. She takes over that and that idea and thinks it applies well to how the Nazis viewed the Aryan race. Its scholars agree that Nietzsche would not have approved of this appropriation, but the last 10 years of his life are pretty tragic. She would wheel him out on, he was already rather well known thanks to the propagation of his work and ideas, and she would wheel him out on to a porch or a balcony for people to see as they came by. He dies in 1900 and becomes extremely influential in the 20th century. inspiring existentialism, most famously. And existentialism was a philosophy that was popularized in the middle of the 20th century, especially by Jean-Paul Sartre. The idea that, the name, the reason I'm going to explain this now is because there are some passages where existentialism makes its appearance in The Birth of Tragedy, so I want to make sure you see them. Where does the term existentialism come from? It is meant to be a contrast to essentialism. Essentialism is the idea that humans have an essence, that we have a specific nature, much the way that Plato viewed us, that humans were designed by nature for specific tasks and certain goals. The existentialists countered that there is no unique human essence, there is just mere existence, and therefore the essence is up for us to design. We are radically free, as Sartre put it. This also means that, however, that, and it's probably the better part of the existentialist philosophy, that we are born into a universe without meaning or purpose, and there is no divine entity that will resolve our questions or our problems. We are alone in the universe. Okay, good. So let me dive into Birth of Tragedy. The most famous thesis is already apparent early on here, where he distinguishes between the Dionysian and the Apollonian elements, which he says are evident in art. Where does he get these terms? Well, Apollo was the god of the sun for the Greeks. He represents light, clarity, distinction. Distinctions become apparent in the light of day. At dusk, things become blurred. In light of day, you see outlines of things. You see individuals. So he's the god of individuality. He's the god of reason, which defines things. Definition literally means to define, means to put a line around things. Dionysus was the god of wine and revelry. And in celebrations to Dionysus, the ancient Greeks would blur all their boundaries. Under the influence of wine, perhaps inspired by the wine, your rank in society matters less. It is forgotten. Your difference from other people. You are drawn to other people. A crowd under the influence of Dionysus, a drunken crowd becomes a writhing, uniform mass. So Dionysus is the Dionysian element is the blurring of boundaries. The Apollonian element is the emphasis on distinction and difference. About the gods, about the Greek gods, an early discussion here is why the Greeks conceived the Olympian gods at all. What needs, as he puts it on page 41 in the edition I've ordered for you all, which is Walter Kaufmann's edition. He was a well-known early translator, American translator of Nietzsche. He tells us early on here, Nietzsche does, he asks the question, what needs prompted the ancient Greeks to conceive the Olympian gods? What needs prompted them to conceive these gods? His answer is that they created their gods in order to be able to live. They could not live in this hostile, mysterious, confounding universe without creating the gods, without putting some kind of human face on these things. He says that the gods were their response to the, quote, terror and horror of existence. This leads him to scorn the idea that art harkens back to or invokes our harmony with nature, as if Homer were, quote, reared in the bosom of nature. Hardly. Rather, Homer and art as such are the, quote, victory of the Apollonian illusion over nature. Art is a victory over nature. The title of this book is Birth of Tragedy. He's interested in the origins of tragedy. This would have been a very hot topic in Germany at the time, in the middle of the 1800s. Germany was a center of archaeology and in particular archaeological interest in classical Greece. It's around this time period that a famous German archaeologist whose name escapes me makes it his business to uncover the historical site of the city of Troy. And that was a big endeavor, widely followed. German archaeologists in this period also bring back a lot of very important art from classical Greece and Egypt, which is housed in museums in Berlin. So they were very interested in this time period. They were also very interested in trying to understand Greek culture. And one of the curiosities of Greek culture was tragedy. Where did this idea of tragedy come from? In particular, I mean, the tragic plays that the ancient Greeks would have assembled to watch. You know, it's a good question. Why do we have, where did these theatrical productions come from, right? And in particular, where did they come from in ancient Greece, where they have these exhaustively designed theaters? These were no impromptu places. If you've ever heard, a Greek theater is a feat of engineering. Greek amphitheater, which is made of stone, and the stage sits at the bottom, and the seats in a circle, at least a half circle, surround the stage, rising up. And what is remarkable about these theaters is that they are so exquisitely engineered that if you sit at the top, or if you sit anywhere in the theater, you can hear the people on stage as if they were next to you. You can hear with the same volume. So this was something that the ancient Greeks took very seriously. The famous tragedies that, when Nietzsche is referring to tragedy, he has in mind, there are three famous tragic authors in this order, by the way, of chronology, this chronological order. You have Aeschylus, you have Sophocles, and Euripides. And Aeschylus is the first chronologically, then Sophocles, then Euripides. And Euripides seems to have been a contemporary of Socrates. Sophocles wrote some of what are perhaps the best known tragedies. This would include Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone, my favorite. Any case, about the origin of origin of tragedy. There are a lot of people during Nietzsche's time. He mentions philosophers in particular, some very well-known philosophers, who are speculating about the origin of tragedy, where this came from, why the Greeks came up with this, and what purpose this served to them. He tells us a couple interesting things here at the beginning. First of all, he points out that tragedies, originally speaking, they were just a chorus, right? A key feature of an ancient Greek tragedy is that you have the action of the stage. You have Oedipus and his daughters, for example, and then you have a chorus which comments on the action of the play. The early Greek tragedies, even before Aeschylus, in this very origins, it would have been these tragedies would have been entirely just the chorus on the stage, reciting something to an audience. So my first thought is, doesn't sound very exciting to me. And by the way, if I remember my history of theater class, which I took in college 20 some years ago, Thespis was the first person who stepped out of the chorus, and to portray some individual. And so that's where we get the word thespian from, thespian, which now refers to people who are involved in stage acting. In any case, the tragedy, these early tragedies, you had nothing but a chorus on stage. And so that should be the focus of our interest. What did that chorus do? Why was that chorus important? Schlegel, who is a German philosopher of this period, I think just before Nietzsche, he has a theory. He says that the chorus was, quote, somehow the essence and extract of the crowd of the spectators. Or as Nietzsche puts it, or as the ideal spectator. The chorus is the ideal spectator. What does that mean? That suggests that the chorus is indicating to the audience what they should see, how they should understand. Nietzsche ultimately is not persuaded by this, because he says the chorus pretended to think that the action on stage was real. And the ideal spectator would not do that. The other major theory that Nietzsche deals with is from Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, who was also an important philosopher of art from the early 1800s. And he says that a chorus is, quote, a living wall that tragedy constructs around itself to close itself off from the world of reality and preserve its ideal domain. It's a quote on page 58 in the translation I've ordered for you all. A chorus is a living wall that walls off what's going on the stage, that this is an ideal domain and the outside world, cutting off from reality, the outside world. He also rejects this as if what was happening on stage were isolated, and that is not what he thinks was really going on here in these early tragedies. And the reason he says this, or the reason he knows this, is because he says there is an added feature of early tragedies which these philosophers ignore. So one fact we already have about early tragedies, they were entirely populated by the chorus on the stage. But he says there's another fact that people don't realize or recognize about the chorus, is that the chorus was composed of satyrs, S-A-T-Y-R-S. This is a point he makes on 59. They are made up of satyrs. And that is pretty significant in his view. What's a satyr? A satyr is half animal, half human. If I recall correctly, the upper part is human, the lower part is animal. Usually satyrs are presented in Greek art as having hooves of like a goat. But they are also presented as having a giant phallus. What does that mean? Well, that means that the early Greek satyrs, they were yes, human. They were also they were a Dionysian blurring of human and animal distinctions. But as far as character goes, the satyrs were always bawdy and raunchy, and they had sex on their mind, and they were driven by their appetites. Good. So this is very important for Nietzsche, and he tells us in page 59 here, in the top, he said, in this sense, let me make sure I'm on the right page. I'm not on their page, excuse me. I believe the Greeks, he said, the Greek man of culture felt himself nullified in the presence of the satiric chorus. He felt, the onlooker, that is, the audience felt nullified. And this is the most immediate effect of the Dionysian tragedy, that the state and society quite generally the gulfs between man and man give way to an overwhelming feeling of unity, leading back to the very heart of nature. The metaphysical comfort with which I'm suggesting even now every true tragedy leads us, that life is at the bottom of things, despite all the changes of appearance, indestructibly powerful and pleasurable. This comfort appears in incarnate clarity in the course of satyrs, a course of natural beings who live ineradicably, as it were, behind all civilization and remain eternally the same, despite the changes of generation and the history of nations. So tragedy, a couple points here. Again, this is on page 59 in the Kaufman translation, in the middle of the page. Tragedy should offer metaphysical comfort. What does that mean? It should offer some kind of comfort about our nature, about the human condition, if you will. That life is at the bottom of things, indestructibly powerful and pleasurable. The satyrs represent the kind of power of nature. But they are a dangerous presentation at the same time. The satyr is a presentation of human nature at bottom, because humans are animals in our core. We, underneath our clothes, beneath our social trappings, our social presentations, our titles, our names, we are animals. We are born, we die, and our bodies decompose. And we are driven by material and animalistic desires for sex, for food, and that is an undeniable fact that the satyr reminds us of. He goes on here in the middle of 59, he says, with this chorus, the profound Helene, that is Greek, uniquely susceptible to the tenderest and deepest suffering, comforts himself, having looked boldly right into the terrible destructiveness of so-called world history, as well as the cruelty of nature, and being in danger of longing for a Buddhist negation of the will. Art saves him, and through art, life. So what does the satyr present? It offers the audience, the Greek audience, a chance to look right into the terrible destructiveness of nature, the cruelty of nature. And then it's also covering up at once. Because the satyrs, they were also humorous, they were also funny, right? And this is what art does in general. Art shows us the truth of nature, the destructiveness of nature. On an existentialist note, the meaninglessness of life. But instead of leaving us in anguish, it covers that up. Art is a covering. Art is a decoration. And there's pleasure. So it offers an important metaphysical moment and meditation, but there's also pleasure in that it covers that up. It offers comfort. And as he quotes here in 59, art saves him, and through art, life. This is the purpose of art for Nietzsche, right? Following on Hegel, where Hegel says the purpose of art is to lead us to greater self-consciousness and to articulate philosophical questions and truths. Nietzsche has a very big goal for art indeed. Art is what saves life. It's what makes life livable. It is what helps us endure in this meaningless and terrifying world. When we are released from the Dionysian state, Nietzsche says we are nauseated. We're nauseated at the sight of our existential plight. Nausea is the premier existential emotion. Sartre writes a famous book called La Nausée, nausea. When you meditate, when you recognize and meditate upon the meaninglessness of life, you will be nauseated. We are nauseated because we have looked at the satyr and seen the horrible and terrifying fact of our nature. But art plays a critical role in helping us face up to this. And he says, because he tells us that action requires the veils of illusion. What does that mean? Well, if we were to meditate or dwell on the meaninglessness of life, we might be gripped by paralysis and say, what's the meaning? What's the point of it all? But art helps us endure. Art helps us act because it offers veils of illusion that cover that up. And he said that's why he calls art also a saving sorceress. That's on page 60. The Greeks looked at nature longingly, he says, firmly and fearlessly, not naively or romantically. They were in awe of the sexual omnipotence of nature, whereas modern man, Nietzsche says, hardly looks at nature in the same way. He looks at it sentimentally and timorously. This is a jab at romanticism, right? People like Thoreau and Rousseau who think that nature is hospitable and friendly. That is not the case. Nature is violent, but also violently creative, according to Nietzsche. He says the Dionysian Greek wants truth in nature and in their most, the Dionysian Greek wants truth and nature, and he wants them in their most forceful form. So he is speaking admirably of the ancient Greeks in contrast to us. Here's another important statement about what is going on in the aesthetic experience of tragedy. This is a quote on page 64. He says, middle of the page, the process of the tragic chorus is the dramatic proto-phenomenon. To see oneself transformed before one's own eyes and to begin to act as if one had actually entered into another body, another character. This process stands at the beginning of the origin of drama. Here we have something different from the rhapsodist who does not become fused with his images, but like a painter sees them outside himself as objects of contemplation. Here we have a surrender of individuality and a way of entering into another character. And this phenomenon is encountered epidemically. A whole throng experiences the magic of this transformation. So the tragedy would have been a Dionysian experience where your individual boundaries in the audience, the individual boundaries of the audience members would have faded away and the crowd would have felt unified. So there are some, you need to understand this passage here as Nietzsche saying what is the standard of art, what art should do. Art should transform people. It is a transformation. It is where you enter into another body, another character, where you transcend the boundaries of your individual being. This is all very dramatic. On 68, he says that what tragedy does is it issues the key wisdom of nature, which is that it dissolves the rigid law of individuation. He talks at length here about Oedipus. Why is Oedipus a model tragedy? Nietzsche thinks that Sophocles is the best of the tragedians. Excuse me. I'll just call them tragic writers. Excuse me. The problem with Aeschylus, who comes before Sophocles, I think Nietzsche admires him very much, but I don't believe we have many excellent writings of Aeschylus beyond his best known one is Prometheus Bound, which Nietzsche talks about as well. But let me talk for a second about Oedipus. Why is this a model? How does this exemplify what Nietzsche has to say about tragedy? Well, Oedipus, what does he do? Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother, and in the play of Sophocles, has children with his mother. Now, that is not something that human beings do, but that is something that animals will do. So this tragedy offers a glimpse into our animal nature, if you will, and covers it up, of course, through the illusion of the play itself. He talks about Oedipus breaking the law of nature to wring her wisdom from her. I believe he's talking about human nature, to wring the wisdom of nature itself from her. Prometheus is remarkable. He is, speaking now about Aeschylus and Prometheus bound, Prometheus is a man who throws fire from the gods. Why is he remarkable? To Nietzsche, he says that Prometheus's sin was an active sin. In his mind, this distinguishes Prometheus from the story of sin original sin in the Bible. He says that Eve's sin, well, he says this, I don't know if he says it here or elsewhere, but according to Nietzsche, Eve's sin was a passive sin. Eve made a mistake. Eve was duped, if you will, by the stake. Prometheus knew what he was doing. He went and consciously took the fire from the gods. And he says that Prometheus had to suffer for his individuation. He and Oedipus were bold sinners. Leading now to Euripides. This is the tragic author that Nietzsche is not happy with at all. He thinks that he is the demise of tragedy. Euripides is less an artist than he is already a philosopher. He's already at one with Socrates. And Nietzsche's great critique of Western civilization stretches all the way back to Socrates. He credits Socrates with the original sin, if you will, that doomed Western civilization. He says that the god who spoke through Euripides was not Dionysus, but Socrates. And Socrates stands opposed to the project of tragedy. Why is this? Well, let's take a look at page 83. He says at the bottom, we see that Euripides did not succeed in basing the drama exclusively on the Apollinian, and his un-Dionysian tendency actually went astray and became naturalistic and inartistic. Now we should be able to come close to the character of aesthetic Socratism, whose supreme law reads roughly as follows. To be beautiful, everything must be intelligible. As the counterpart to the Socratic dictum, knowledge is virtue. To be beautiful is to be intelligible. That is Socratism. That was Socrates' claim. And indeed, don't forget, back in the Symposium, Plato identifies beauty as one of the forms. So when you truly see beauty, you see it as a form, you see it intellectually and not sensually. I'm going to stop there, and in the next lecture, we will delve deeper into the relationship of Socrates and Euripides and what is wrong with Socratism and how Socratism infected the rest of Western civilization according to Plato. According to Nietzsche. All right, take care, bye.